So in this lecture, we're going to talk about generalization and discrimination, and then we're going to get into some pretty complex experimental designs that seem to go against some of Pavlov's fundamental ideas about association. So the idea of generalization is incredibly important in learning, classical conditioning and instrumental conditioning. It's simply the idea that if an animal, including humans, learn about something, they can keep that association, that learning, in other situations that are similar. Imagine an animal is out foraging for food and it bites on this plant and there's a yellow honeybee on there and it gets a sting in its mouth. Well, it sees that color yellow and it makes that association with the pain. Now that's important because what if it comes across another insect and that other insect is yellow, like a wasp or a yellow jacket? It would be really important to say, oh, that's not something completely different. That is similar. And so I should be scared of that as well. We have to generalize what we learn. We can't learn in absolute isolation. However, it's also important in associations, in classical conditioning, to be able to discriminate between similar stimuli. One stimulus provides food, another one that's similar doesn't. It'd be a good idea to know the difference between the two. These are really fundamental principles, and we're going to talk about these in greater detail in section 3 of this course. So generalization is simply the degree to which two stimuli are perceived as being alike and will produce similar condition responses. And discrimination is the degree to which two stimuli are perceived as being different and will produce different condition responses. Let's take an example. Suppose we're doing an auto-shaping experiment with a pigeon, and we use a yellow light. The yellow light is associated with food, yellow light, and food is dropped over and over. And the probability of the animal pecking the yellow light goes up and up, the condition response. And now the animal pecks the yellow key light 95% of the time. What if we then presented an orange light to the animal? Would the animal respond to an orange light? Well, it's similar to the yellow, but a little different. Do you think the animal will respond at all to the orange light? Yeah, it probably would, even though the orange light has never been presented with food. The yellow light was presented with food a lot, but the orange light was never presented with food. And still the animal responds to it. Why? Because it generalizes. Yellow and orange are similar. What about a dark purple light? Well, that's not close to yellow. Yellow and orange are similar, but yellow and this purple are not as similar. Still might get a response because there is some generalization. There's a light on. It's maybe in the same spot. But we might not get the same level of response. Why? Because the animal discriminates the yellow and the purple light. And so if the animal's trained on a yellow light and then presented an orange or a purple or any of these colors, we might see that colors that are more similar in wavelength to yellow will produce a greater generalized response. And those that are different will reduce that. We call that a generalization decrement. A decrement because of the lack of perfect generalization. So this is what we call a generalization gradient. And it's the idea that, let's say the yellow light is the conditioned stimulus. It is associated with food. But as we move away from the original conditioned stimulus in terms of difference in wavelength of light, we get a decrease in response. There is still some response, even though the animal was never trained on a green light and food, we still get a good response to it, but not as much as the original. Again, this is a generalization gradient. The y-axis is representing some conditioned response. So the degree that we have a similar response, the similarity here, is called a generalization. The animal generalizes the association. However, the drop is a measure of discrimination, the degree to which the animal sees the stimuli as different. So, generalization is the similarity in response because of the fact that the animal sees them as similar. They generalize, so we get a generalized conditioned response. And we use the word generalization decrement to say, okay, they see them as different. And the degree to which they see them as different reduces the conditioned response. Generalization decrement is a measure of discrimination. Generalization and discrimination mean the opposite things. Let's say we train yellow. Yellow is presented with an unconditioned stimulus, like food. And we get this nice high conditioned response. And then we test green. We just show the animal green, and we also get this nice high conditioned response. Not as much, but there is a good deal of generalization. But if we go back and forth and do differential conditioning, sometimes this is called discrimination learning, where yellow is reinforced and green is not. Yellow is reinforced and green is not. The animal will then learn and will get a decrease in the conditioned response. The animal learns the discrimination. We often use this technique to identify perception in animals, what they are able to sense and perceive. Let me give you an example. A friend of mine in college worked with dolphins, and he studied high-frequency discrimination in sound. So the question is, can a dolphin discriminate between, let's say, 30,000 hertz and 30,100 hertz? Very similar sounds, but he reinforced one and didn't reinforce the other. And if the animal showed the same response to both of them, even though you reinforce one and not the other, then the animal cannot sense or perceive a difference between 30,000 and 30,100. But if the animal responds to one and not the other, the animal has those sensory capabilities. Okay, now let's move on and talk about some more contemporary theories. Pavlov was back in the 1900s. We got some new theories in the late 1900s. So let's review Pavlov's theory of why animals make associations. What is necessary? The first we talked about a lot. Contiguity. Pavlov simply said, bring two stimuli together in time and they connect. In the brain, they associate. You need to have that contiguity. Areas of the brain need to be active at the same time for associations to be created. And if you have contiguity between two stimuli, they occur together in time. They will associate. They will connect. The more times they're brought together in time, the stronger those associations. So with repeated exposure, you strengthen the association. Ring a bell, give a dog food twice, the animal's going to salivate maybe a little bit to the bell. Do it a lot, ring a bell, and that animal's salivating all over your floor. Another thing that was important that we've talked about is the temporal relationship. For Pavlov, the CS should precede the US. Backward conditioning doesn't work really well. And finally, I want to talk about another fundamental principle, and that is the principle of independence. And this is where we get into the issue of how does an animal learn about stimuli in a compound stimulus. A compound stimulus might be something like a blue light and a yellow light shown together. Those have the same sensory modality of light. But a compound stimulus could be of different modalities. Let me give you an example. Ring a bell and show a light at the same time. The bell sounds, ring, ring, and the light comes on, and the animal is shocked on its foot. Maybe we're doing some conditioned suppression experiments. It's a compound stimulus. Two stimuli together, followed by a US. And according to the independence assumption, also known as the independence rule, components of a compound, the two stimuli, components of a compound stimulus gain excitatory associative strength independently of each other. They'd also gain inhibitory associative strength independently. In other words, if you showed, let's say, an orange light and a red light and dropped food, this is a real simple thing. It doesn't take thinking, it doesn't take decision making, it doesn't take choice. It just says, hey, somewhere in the brain, there's activation because of the orange light. And somewhere in the brain, there is activation because of the red light. And the animal gets food. So, because these areas are presented at the same time, the orange gets associated with food, the red gets associated with food. The components of a compound stimulus is orange-red. Components are orange, that's one component, and red is the other component. If I rang a bell and showed a light, those are two stimuli. Bell is in the brain. It's activating the auditory parts of the brain. The light activating visual parts. The animal is then shocked or fed or something. Those two stimuli should gain association without really interfering with each other's ability to associate. They're in the brain. The animal gets food. And so connections are made between the orange and the food and the red and the food. This is a very simple assumption. We sometimes call this a parsimonious assumption. We'll come back to that word in another lecture. It just means the most simple assumptions. The animal doesn't choose what to learn. It's not at a conscious level. These stimuli in the brain, the animal gets fed, there's association. Each stimulus connects to the food independently of each other. That's the independence rule. And then in the 1960s, an experiment came out that seemed to violate the independence assumption, Pavlov's independence rule. This experiment was called overshadowing. And this is how it's done. It can be done with two groups, group 1 and group 2. But if you really want to balance things, make sure everything is nice and controlled, you'd have 4 groups. This is how it's done. Stimulus A and stimulus B are presented to an animal, followed by a US, or reinforcement. A and B. Now, we've been using these nomenclatures of A and B, using these variables a lot. Hopefully you're getting comfortable with them. But it might be A is a light, B is a tone, and then the animal is shocked. That's possible. Or a blue light and a yellow light, and the animal is reinforced in auto-shaping. Or a tone and a light and air puffed in the eye. 2 stimuli together and then followed by the US. We do that for a lot of training in group 1. That we call it stage 1, and we can assume the animal's getting a good deal of training. Then we test. We simply present A by itself, one of the components, and we say, what's the response? What response do we get? Okay? Now, group 2 is a control group for group 1. We call group 1 the overshadowing group. In group 2, stage 1, they never see 2 stimuli, they only see one of them. A is reinforced. So, let's give the example. A is a tone, B is a light, and US is shock. In this group, A is a tone, and the animal shock. But there is no light, right? There's not a compound stimuli. And then we test. And what we find is that the response to A in group 1 is less than the response to in group 2 to the same stimulus. In other words, because of this training, A and B together, what is assumed here is the animal doesn't learn about A as much. According to the independence rule, having B there should not affect learning at all. A is learned about, B is learned about independently of each other. But what we get from a result is something happened where A is not producing the same response. When conditioned in a compound and tested by itself, it does not produce the same response as when A is conditioned by itself and tested by itself. Now, group 3 and 4, they're the same thing as group 1 and 2. It's just balancing. All it is doing A and B and reinforcement and testing B and B by itself and testing B. We're just making sure that the salience or the brightness or the attention of the stimuli are all balanced for. You really can just do group 1 and 2. But some people like to do 3 and 4 just to have a nice rounded experiment. But in group 3, we train A and B with a US, test B, and in group 4, we just train B by itself and test B, and the animal responds a lot more to B in group 4 than to B in group 3. So people said, A is in temporal contiguity with reinforcement in this group. It should learn. It should learn the same whether B is there or A is there. So while this has temporal contiguity, they're not really responding. What people say is B overshadowed the animal's ability to learn A, or A overshadowed the ability for the animal to learn B here. Again, what we're doing is we're taking Pavlov's theories, which were very parsimonious, very straightforward, doesn't require cognitive rationalization, reasoning, thinking. It's just stimuli in the brain and US and make connections. And overshadowing seemed to say, maybe not. So here are results. Simply, the animal responding to A after being presented A and B doesn't respond as much as group 2, which only was conditioned on A. Here, animal responding to B after being conditioned on A and B doesn't respond as much as to B alone. This takes a little bit of work, takes a little practice. Now, does overshadowing violate the independence assumption? By the way, independence assumption, if you look it up, it might say independence rule, might say independence assumption. Doesn't mean the same thing. If it does, something else is happening during classical conditioning that Pavlov is not accounting for. That's why it's kind of a big deal to say, hey, if we're going to say that Pavlov was wrong about something, we better have some good proof. Does it violate independence assumption? The answer is kinda. Maybe. I know that that's not helping you much. But we want to look for maybe possible other reasons. Other reasons. We don't want to get rid of Pavlov's ideas without really good evidence, because Pavlov, his rules of association are very simple. Temporal contiguity, stimuli in the brain are active at the same time they associate. Whether they are by themselves or in a compound, they're going to associate. Doesn't matter. Independence rule. We have contiguity here, but we seem to maybe not have independence. Okay, So a guy named Clark Hall, and we're going to come back to Clark Hall in a later lecture, he was really interested in this, and he said, I'm not 100% convinced that overshadowing, the results of overshadowing, violate one of Pavlov's rules. It might be due to another thing. It might be due to a problem of generalization. We talk about generalization, right? A generalization decrement. Maybe the stimuli are looking different. He said that maybe it's because of afferent neural interaction and generalization decrement. Oh my gosh, those are huge long word phrases there. Let's break it down what he means. Basically, he's saying, let's go back here. He's saying that A here looks different than A here. They look different. They sound different. Something about them is different. Something perceptually is different. It's not a learning problem. It's a sense problem. It's a perception problem. A looks different here than here. It's kind of like A looks yellow here and kind of orange here. I'm not saying that's exactly what happens. What I'm saying is they're different. If this was a tone and a bell, and you played them at the same time, wouldn't that affect how the tone is perceived because the bell is there? It sounds different. Now, what he said by afferent neural interaction, meaning that when these two stimuli are perceived together into the brain, we call that afferent or sensory, something is happening where they're messing with each other. They're mixing up. And because of that, A looks different here when tested than when trained. And because it's perceived as different, the animal doesn't respond as well. These are the same. Look at the trained on A, tested on A. They're the same, no difference. So we're not going to get a generalization decrement. Here, B is somehow different because of the context it is presented than here. They look different, so they're not going to respond as much. It's not a learning problem. Independence is perfectly fine. It's a perception problem. So Hull kind of put little apostrophes on them to say A and B together is a little A here and A here. They look a little different. A here and A here look the same. Overshadowing does not necessarily violate the independence assumption or the independence rule. We don't want to get rid of Pavlov. Pavlov's principles are very simple, very straightforward, and until we have really strong evidence, we don't want to violate his theory. Let's look at this. Let's look at this perceptually. This is kind of an example. Okay, so suppose we have two lights here, a red and a orange. I'm just saying, and let's say this is stimulus A and this is stimulus B. So in the process of perceiving these stimuli, somehow in the process, afferently into the brain, they kind of affect each other. So they look a little different. Now, if A is presented by itself, A looks just like A in the brain. A is representing A as it is in the world. But if in compound, A is kind of modified a little bit. And because of that difference, we're going to get that generalization decrement. Here's an example that I just think is kind of fun to try to think about what I'm trying to say here, what Hull was trying to say here. Here are two stimuli, the circles. Do you see the circles? Do they look different to you? Let's say the circle color, the grayness of the circle, is stimulus A. And let's say A and B together look like this. Now, what's interesting is this circle and this circle are exactly the same circle. They're the same exact shade of gray. And you're like, well, no. This one's gray and this one's kind of white and this one's darker gray. No. They change in our perception because of their surroundings. B in this case is the context. It's slightly darker. C here is the context slightly lighter. What? All I'm doing is removing the background here. I didn't do anything else. I didn't change the circles at all. I didn't change the shades. But look how much different they look when I remove the context. It's kind of what Hull was saying. If I have a compound, in other words, the stimulus is next to another stimulus, it looks a little different. We can do this with color too. Those two circles are exactly the same color. And you're like, no, they're not. One's yellow and one's green. Okay, that's how you're perceiving them. If I trained an animal on this color and tested them on this color, we would get a generalization decrement, even though they're the same. Watch, if I just push this one over. I just dragged it over. That's all I did. I didn't change its color on the way, but I changed its context. I changed what it was next to. Remove this context and you can see they're the exact same color. So what Hull was trying to say was A trained in one context around B, whatever B is, it looks a little different. It's a little different. If I trained A and tested A in the exact same situation, they look the same. We would expect a generalization decrement here just because of the difference in how they are perceived, right? So here we are in the 60s, and overshadowing experiments were coming out, and people were going, Pavlov's rules are so fundamental and so simple. They don't require thinking or rationalization or contemplation or decision making at all. They just require stimuli being active in the brain at the same time as other stimuli. Which I know what you're saying. You're like, well, I think about stuff. Well, you're a human. We can classical conditioning a flatworm, an insect, a very simple creature. Is that one thinking and contemplating what it wants to learn about? Remember, this is at an unconscious level. And Pavlov's rules were real simple. Just bring the stimuli in, and as long as there's a US, they're going to connect. Overshadowing, some people say, okay, I'm not sure if the afferent neural interaction generalization decrement really helps us there, really explains it. So there's people back and forth. But another experiment came out. This one's called blocking. It was done by Kamen in 1968. And I will start by saying there's a debate about overshadowing, but not about blocking. Blocking violates the independence rule or the independence assumption because it controls for the things Hull worried about: generalization problems, discrimination problems, interactions in perception. It controls for that. Blocking and overshadowing to a degree set in motion new theories about learning. We also know that blocking can help us to understand a lot of other types of learning or learning difficulties. Let's go through the procedure of blocking. The procedure of blocking has two stages. Stage 1, followed by stage 2, and then a test. So, in stage 1, a stimulus is reinforced. B, a tone, beep, and the animal is reinforced over and over and over again until we get a nice asymptotic level. We don't need to, but we can. We can train this one up. Train. Really strong connection. In our control group, we do the same with another stimulus. Maybe this is a different tone sound. Maybe that's a bell or a metronome or whatever. Then in stage 2, we kind of do an overshadowing. In other words, we train a compound. A and B are reinforced over and over again. A and B are reinforced over and over again. Then we test A. Group 2 also has the same experience as group 1 in every way from stage 2 on. We don't bring C in, we bring B. They've never seen A, they've never seen B. We reinforce, reinforce, reinforce. Test A. Here in group 1, B already is a signal of reinforcement. Here it's not. That's why it's a good control. And if we have any generalization problem, A trained here and tested here look different, it's equated in both. That's why it's such a good control. We might have a generalization decrement. A looks different here than here. But that's true here as well. A and A here are in the same context. They should train the same. But here's what we find. We find that group 1 doesn't respond much to A, but group 2 does. If we train B really high up, the animal high asymptotic level, we may get absolutely no response or very, very little response to A here. Even though A was presented in temporal contiguity with reinforcement a lot, the animal might not respond here at all. Let's do a Pavlov experiment. Let's not do overshadowing or anything like that. Let's do a Pavlov experiment. Salivating dogs, even though it's messy, don't care. Group 1 dogs. A bell is presented with food. We're going to do that for 30 trials. Ring, food. Ring, food. Ring, food. We're going to do that all day. Lots of trials. Okay? And now when I ring a bell, that animal's salivating all over the ground. Got it? Group 2 doesn't get a bell. Group 2 gets a metronome. And that's reinforced for the same amount of trials. Tick, 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 food. Tick, 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 food. Tick, 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 food. Oh, really strong conditioning. If I present a bell to this group, salivates. If I present the metronome to this group, it salivates a lot. Then I stop this and I move over to stage 2. And I come to group 1 and I present A. Let's say A is a light. A light comes on and a bell rings and the animal gets food. Light comes on, bell rings, and the animal gets food, and I do that for 30 trials, a whole bunch. Has the light been in temporal contiguity with food? Oh yeah, 30 trials. So the light in the head is represented somewhere, and that has followed with food. The US, the food, and the light are happening together in the brain. They should connect according to the independence assumption. Why? They have temporal contiguity. The light's in the brain, the food's in the mouth. They should connect. Group 2, we do the same thing. Light comes on, bell, food. Light comes on, bell, food. Light comes on, bell, food. Over and over. But in group 2, the animal has never seen A before, stage 2. But that's true for group 1. It's the first time they've ever seen the light. In this group, they've never saw the bell, ever. They had a metronome, but the bell's ringing. This group, group 1, oh, they've seen the bell. That bell was associated with food. But any problem of interactions or generalization problems because of this compound is equal in both groups. And even though A, the light, was presented with food over and over and over again, the animal doesn't salivate to it. Group 1, they don't salivate. You ring the bell, the animal doesn't salivate. Group 2, they salivate, but group 1 doesn't. So, we've controlled for generalization problems. We say there's a compound here and the animal doesn't learn about A. Even though it was in the brain and food was in the mouth, the animal doesn't learn about it. They should have learned about it independently. So, the fact that group 1 doesn't respond here at all and group 2 does says that A was associated with food here but was not associated with food here. Even though it was presented in the brain and the animal was representing food, we did all the things Pavlov wants us to do and we don't get association. Blocking violates the independence rule. And it led to some really interesting theories that we're going to talk about in the next lecture to account for blocking and overshadowing, but also this new theory. This theory is very different from Pavlov, accounts for a lot of other learning as well.